Hello everyone, welcome to today's live event hosted by 360 Learning and Appraisd on how to create a performance management strategy that accelerates growth from within. So we're still waiting for some people to join at the moment. I'll just give everybody half a minute or so before we get started. In the meantime, if you'd like to share in the chat window where you're joining from, which organisation you're with, it'd be great to hear from you. Hi, Christian. Hi, Mark from East Sussex. Welcome today. Great. So I think I'll kick things off now. My name's Freddie. I'm the content lead for the UK here at 360 Learning, and I'm going to be hosting the session today. So just a couple of things on housekeeping before we start. So you will receive replay links after the session. Those are going to be available to you at any time. As you can see, there are various sections on your screen, so I'll just take you through a couple of these sections just now. So feel free to play around with all the areas on your screen. You can move them around, resize the slide, make parts bigger or smaller, and minimize certain areas as well. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll see our lovely presenters for today. Underneath, you have the questions tab. So feel free to submit your questions throughout. We are going to have a Q&A at the end of the session. So just pop them in the box, and then Jessie and Amira will be available to answer your questions at the end. Underneath the question box, you'll see there's some other relevant resources that you can also check out as well. And underneath the speaker info, we've got a link to our next webinar that we're also doing on what enterprise companies can learn from one-person L&D teams. Lastly, there's a little smiley face at the bottom of the screen. That's the reactions button. So if you like the content that you're seeing, or if you agree, or whatever, give us some emojis. We want to hear from you. We're also going to be running some polls during the session as well. So these will appear throughout the presentation. So please submit your answers. We'll go and we'll have some discussion there as well. So I am very happy to introduce our speakers today. So we're going to hear from Jessie Jensen, HR Director and Business Partner. Jessie, if you want to say a quick hello to our audience today.
Hi all, super excited to be here. Look forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks, Jessie. I'd also like to introduce Amira Kohler, Director of Performance and Change at Appraisd. Hi, Amira, thanks for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very much looking forward to it.
Great, perfect. So let's jump into our discussion topic, how to create a performance management strategy that accelerates growth from within. So first up, we're going to hear from Amira, who's going to talk about why developing existing talent is key in today's economic climate. Amira is then going to share what that journey from conventional to continuous performance management looks like, before handing over to Jessie, who's going to discuss why decentralized learning is key to performance improvement, and how you can encourage a culture of collaboration through peer-guided learning and reviews as well. So that's enough from me. I'll hand over to you, Amira.
Thank you very much. I'm ready. Sorry. Okay, so first subject, why is developing your existing talent so important in today's economic climate? So you don't need me to remind you, sadly, that we are in pretty tough economic times, and just a few of the headlines here that I've grabbed from various different publications over the last few weeks. So obviously we are teetering as a globe on the edge of a recession, obviously exacerbated by the ongoing war in Ukraine. I'm based in the UK, and in the UK specifically, we've had a pretty flat growth over the last 10 years, and productivity is flat and inflation is high. And we also have the extra interesting dynamic that despite a cost of living crisis, there's a lot of people leaving the workforce, partly exacerbated by the pandemic, but also because there's lots of economically inactive individuals within the UK. So, and I'm sure, you know, across the globe, there's plenty of different dynamics that are going on. So all of this adds up to the fact that it is absolutely makes huge economic sense to hold on to that talent that you already have in your organization. And just looking at some of the statistics about the economics of this, obviously replacing an employee costs an organization a huge amount of money, whether that's, you know, from an entry level right through to a senior executive salary. So you can see here that, you know, that variance is great, but it's either way, it's expensive. And you really, really want to hold on to the talent that you have. But it's wider than just economics, because losing talent is obviously a great deal of a problem to do with a loss of knowledge and depth of insight into your organization. And also it takes time to recruit and to upskill any replacement employees. But it also makes people feel a bit jumpy from what I've always seen in organizations, particularly if it's really talented employees who are leaving, because other people might begin to wonder, well, what do they know that I don't? So it just isn't, it's just, you really want to hold on to your best people. And that is particularly true if they are some of the relatively rare employees who are really highly engaged. Because this is an interesting piece of research that Gallup did a year or so ago. And they found that, quite scarily, only 21% of employees worldwide are actively engaged at work, which is obviously quite a damning statistic. Those do vary, obviously, hugely from organisation to organisation, country to country, and you really want to be one of the rare companies that has a hugely more, a higher proportion than 21%. I suppose the only good news, the kind of silver lining way of looking at this, is that the opportunity to increase the proportion of engaged employees is obviously absolutely massive. So let's see the upside of this. And leaders are now really, I think, beginning to have their eyes open to the benefit of high engagement. So this is a statistic from a Harvard Business Review research report recently that showed that 90% of business leaders really can see the linkage between engaged employees performing better, being more highly productive, and obviously that is critical to their business success. So that's fantastic that there is a linkage. You know, business leaders are really having their eyes wide open to the linkage between these subjects, which maybe used to be sort of just perceived as the territory of just HR. And I guess that makes sense, because the difference between engaged employees and disengaged employees is pretty significant. It's pretty huge. So just to talk through this just briefly. So everyone knows what it feels like when you come across that absolute fantastic rare commodity of the really highly engaged employee who works without any sort of, no one having to ask them to go the extra mile. They work passionately and with real commitment, because fundamentally they feel really connected to the company. They feel like they care about it and it cares about them. And therefore what they're able to do is to really make a difference to being more innovative and solving more problems, being that much more proactive on behalf of the organization, both internally and externally. And therefore they're fantastic brand ambassadors in front of clients and also internally. But probably for the sake of this webinar, the thing that they do most importantly is they are constantly looking to develop themselves and their colleagues. They very naturally are learning individuals who want to drive growth and feel that they are just constantly a sort of vessel for further improvement and further kind of breadth of skills and development. On the other hand, we all know that disengaged employees feel quite different. So, you know, they work in a very different way. Sometimes are just doing the bare minimum. Quiet quitters became some of the terminology during the pandemic. which might describe some of these people who kind of just clock off really as soon as they feel that that's an acceptable thing to do. And maybe in a virtual environment might be some of those people who never seem to have their camera on unless they've got a good reason for it. What's interesting is they actually do take up quite a lot of management time, these individuals, because managers are always having to try and cajole them to go, to complete their objectives or their tasks, or to put themselves forward for opportunities. And they can have a real impact on reducing, obviously, customers' faith in the brand, because they don't really feel that they are that invested in the whole organisation and what it stands for. But they can also be quite hard to spot and manage, which is one of the reasons why, when I come on to talking about continuous performance management, why I think it is so critical that there is an ongoing and really regular cadence of conversations and check-ins and discussions between the manager and the employee, so that they are constantly being engaged and maybe noticed and called out if you have some of these more problematic disengaged employees. And thinking about it there, it struck me, and maybe when we come to the questions, if anyone else has any answers to this, maybe please put in the chat whether you think there are any other ways to increase the proportion of engaged employees. Because I was thinking about this and I thought, well, mathematically, I guess there's only really three, which is that you want to retain as many of your engaged and highly engaged employees as you possibly can. Secondly, to convert any disengaged employees ideally into engaged employees, which might be quite tricky, but is definitely a good strategy. And thirdly, whenever you do lose a disengaged employee, to actually replace them with engaged recruits. And so obviously these, you really want to be doing as much as possible to increase the proportion of engaged employees. And there are, I think, a few really proven methods to increase engagement and retention. And the first one of these, which was when I was researching for this webinar, I came across this idea from Gartner about stay conversations, which really was really interesting to me, because I've been in this field for a long time, but it wasn't a concept I've ever heard of before, which was that these are semi-structured, personalized, one-to-one conversations between an employee and their manager that are a bit like an exit interview, but at a different time. So an exit interview is obviously an interview that takes place once an individual has declared that they want to leave and that they're on their way out of the organisation. Instead, stay conversations are conversations that would happen much more proactively and early on, when an employee is still active, is still live in an organisation, to try and grab information from them about what's keeping them, what do they like about the organisation, and what maybe they is keeping them or would make them want to leave, so that you can really farm that kind of information, which I think would be really useful. Having excellent career development opportunities, obviously, having an employee opinion survey, and then actually doing something with the results. Having a great company culture and employee value proposition, so that your employees really know what it is that you stand for and why they should want to stay with you. And for the sake of mine and Jessie's, the rest of our this webinar, really absolutely having a continuous and very ongoing approach to performance management and learning and development. And at the same time as all of this, because you want to increase the proportion of engaged employees, really using performance management to address those slightly more problematic disengaged employees and to convert them hopefully into something more handy for everybody within the organisation. So now I just want to have a very quick poll. Is this the... Sorry, Freddie.
Yes, yeah. So the poll should be appearing on your screen now. So you should have all of the options there. Does your company do stay conversations? Yes, no, and they sound useful, or no, but I'm not sure they would be useful.
I'm so curious the results for this, because I know, Amira, when we were prepping for this, we kind of talked about how I haven't used this. I've heard of it, in my past lives, but we haven't been using it here. We do a lot of check-ins against our engagement survey results to better understand them. But I like the idea of kind of what you're saying with these conversations to really shift the types of questions you're asking to pull kind of different data.
Absolutely. And as I said, I'll be very interested to know if people are actually using them. I mean, maybe they don't call them stay conversations. Maybe there's something different. But I think it's different to a career conversation, I think, which is specifically about, where you are in your career and where you're going. This is about much more an engagement conversation at an individual level, not this kind of huge survey that is done, maybe once or twice a year.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've given people a little while to do this. So maybe if I click now and see the results of our little poll here. Okay, interesting. So 21% are doing them. Well done to you guys, because you're very ahead of the curve. But of the others, 63% aren't doing them and say they sound useful, which, that definitely is in line with what I was expecting. And then, a few aren't so convinced, but that's just fine. Okay, so let's move now to the next question, which is what is the difference and why does it matter, we think, about the journey from conventional to continuous performance management? Because at Appraisd, we are a performance management platform. We would like to think that we make a huge difference every day to the thousands of employees that we service and their managers in a performance management platform. But if I really want to explore kind of what is the difference between what has been the conventional and kind of maybe traditional old school way of doing performance management to a more continuous approach, because it's so aligned with so much of what Jessie will be talking about in the learning and development space. So just to talk through a few of the characteristics of what maybe performance management, where it's come from and where maybe in some organizations it still is, which is that performance management of the past was very intermittent and it had a very annual focus. So certainly when I started my career, it was kind of at the beginning of the year, you set your objectives or your manager set them for you, more likely. And then you didn't really think about them for literally months on end. They kind of went into a drawer and you didn't really think about them. And then at the end of the year, it felt like that was the time to reprise them again to see whether you'd actually achieved them or not. And it was almost like the bit in between, the planning to achieve them and actually delivering against them was kind of almost a bit irrelevant. And it was, I guess, all because of the fact that it was about an assessment tool that was very ratings heavy about whether you'd achieved it, not necessarily what you were actually doing in the moment, day to day and week by week. It was also, performance management of the past was very HR driven. So it's very much kind of seen as the HR tool, with HR guiding how, saying when it was time to set objectives, when maybe it was time to do a mid-year review or an end-of-year review discussion, saying this is the time to go and grab feedback from each other because there's going to be an appraisal coming up. And the manager was very much in control. So the employee might have felt a bit done to by this whole process, because whilst they were involved in it, it kind of felt like everyone else was telling them what was going to go on with their performance management. And as a result, it felt pretty generic, like the individual, as I said, was kind of done to, not done with. And very much that there was a one-size-fits-all approach to performance management. And something that I've heard many times is that, and one of the reasons why I think a lot of employees feel quite, when you say the words performance management, they kind of groan, is because it tends to have felt quite fragmented and rather formulaic. It's kind of, they couldn't necessarily see the linkage between objective setting and check-ins and the end of year review and feedback, it all felt a little bit kind of like it was just sections of a process that sort of got farmed out at certain times. The other thing that's really important is, and again, I hear this a lot, that performance management has tended in the past to feel quite judgmental and critical, like it was all there to sort of set objectives and then have something to judge them against at the end of the year. And it's like you were going into your appraisal or performance review like it was, you know, a headmaster's report kind of thing. And then the last two things I'd say is that because, and it's largely because when performance management first came about, which was, you know, years and years and years ago, probably, you know, this goes back actually nearly a century from the days of the Ford motor car going in and a scientific approach to objective setting, that at the time, obviously, there were no systems. Performance management was very manual, it was very paper-based, it was very bureaucratic, administrative, and therefore it was very difficult to really grab in the moment useful, up-to-date data from the whole approach. And the reason why all of this fundamentally was about, why it was like this was, as I said, it was really very much an administrative process, often to provide information for a performance related pay system, which is fine, but it's kind of the process itself seemed to dominate more than the actual day-to-day of what was going on inside for employees. Contrast that with what we would see as a continuous performance management approach and some of the characteristics of that. So probably the key is that continuous performance management, where it is a much more continual, fluid, in the moment, everyday kind of activity, where feedback is much more regular and much more kind of, it's spontaneous. Check-ins are much more frequent and can be scheduled by the manager or the employee at a time that works for either of them. And the focus, we would think, in the best case scenario, is both short-term and long-term. And what I mean by that is, for objectives to feel meaningful and to be motivating, we think that objectives often, in a lot of cases, shouldn't be an annual, rather scripted kind of 1 year long objectives. They should often be much shorter than that, 2 or 3 months long. You know, the kind of objectives that people can picture being able to achieve in a pretty short term kind of basis, so that they stay motivated, whilst at the same time knowing that the company goals and departmental goals are longer term, and therefore that needs to be the long term aim, with aligned cascaded goals being the linkage between long-term and short-term objectives at the individual level. The difference is that whereas maybe in the past performance management was driven by HR and it felt very much like an HR process, HR in a continuous performance management approach does still guide the process. So they still have a very key role to play, but they are guiding that such that the manager, who is behaving more as a coach than just purely as the boss at all times, can, alongside the employee, really feel that they have ownership for their own performance management process, and that they can, schedule conversations at a time that works for them, that feedback is much more spontaneous, for instance. And the new way is much more individually focused, which is able to be managed because of the fact that software now exists. So as I said, individuals might be able to schedule a conversation at a time that works for them, not just because it's that moment in the calendar year. And therefore it feels much more holistic, much more meaningful, much more authentic, developmental and positive. And that lastly, it's all because the system is online and data rich. And you have so much more access to data that is so handy. So fundamentally, there's a very different approach, which is it's a business and engagement tool. So on to our second poll, while Jessie and I just pick up maybe on 1 or 2 themes here. So the question, do you want to just read out the question for us, Freddie?
Sure. So our performance management process is mainly conventional, which was appropriate for us, or mainly conventional and could benefit from changing. And then those that are mainly continuous and just a real mixture of conventional and continuous. So you should be able to just pop your answer on the screen there by selecting which one in this as part of the slide.
And then Jessie, maybe we'll just wait for this, and then you take on your bit, because I'm conscious that we don't want to run out of time for your part.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm gonna be curious to see where the audience is here. I feel like at 360 Learning, we've really tried to move into this continuous process that you're talking about here, but I feel like you're always kind of, trying to push the limits and boundaries to improve.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not, partly because it has had a pretty terrible reputation. It can be quite tricky for people to, to kind of really engage with it. Okay, we'll just give people another 3 seconds or so. I'll click the button and we'll see what the answers are. Yeah, now that is quite a mix.
Yeah, look at that.
Okay, so just pipping the post is the fact that is the idea that it's mainly conventional and needs to change. That's interesting. So 75% are still somewhere in the middle or mainly conventional, looking at these stats, but it's a real mixture. So that's really interesting. And it shows there's quite a range, doesn't it? All right. So Jessie, I will.
All right. So let's, we can, let me get here we go. And so thanks, Amira, and happy to be here, everyone. And so it's interesting to kind of see your results there with this conventional versus continuous performance review, because I think I'm going to kind of move into talking about decentralized learning, which I feel like kind of has some similar themes as far as kind of top-down, collaborative, how you can kind of start to change the narrative. And so Amira talked a little bit about how our most engaged employees want to be learning and developing all the time, and they also want to be developing others. And so that drives this concept of decentralized learning and how you can learn from those around you versus it just being top down. And that's where you start to really shift your mindset here, right? Top-down training is kind of this idea that our leaders, our executives are driving the agenda, what the content should be. But when you shift into collaborative learning, you're really leaning on the employees themselves to raise their hand to say what the gaps are that they want to work on, the skills they want to develop, and leveraging the experts around them to help teach them, help train them. And you start to see this kind of across a lot of different companies. Google AI is a great example where they're encouraging experts to share knowledge inside and outside the company. They're not leaning on their leaders as the perceived experts, but instead actually going out and finding who the experts are. Even McDonald's has done a learning campaign around learning from each other, learning around you. So it's not just something that's happening in the tech industry, it's happening at global companies that are both big and small. And so thinking about how this helps to actually drive performance, I talked about the benefits of that continuous performance conversation and kind of creating that dialogue, driving the individuals to help own their performance. And you can really see that with learning as well. So allowing team members to declare their learning needs, what skill gaps, what challenges are they facing, and how can we better address those? And what we really see is that drives engagement. Learners who have declared a learning need tend to be 30% more engaged, which really helps with driving the ownership of them wanting to learn more. And so just to give an example of how this looks at 360 Learning for us, we kind of have this real-time declaration of needs that's you can upvote on, you can comment, kind of dive into what people are really asking for, what training they want to see. And that really helps your L&D department, your HR department, anyone who's trying to upskill those around them, dive into what do people want to learn, what is the need, how broad is that need, and you can get a bit more focused and zoned in on the trainings that you're doing. So if we stop here a second, I'm kind of curious from this audience, if we jump back into another poll, how many of you are, how do you declare learning needs at your organization? So I'd love for you guys to let us know. We have leadership team. Is your L&D team declaring those needs? Employees? Do you not have a place for employees to kind of raise their hand? And if you have an other, drop it into the chat, because I'm kind of curious about that as well. It's like we need the Jeopardy song here. Amira, how about at Appraisd? What do you guys tend to kind of see as where your learning needs come from?
Well, we're quite small, I have to admit, so we don't have an L&D team. But I think we're pretty progressive. We employees would do this themselves, I have to say.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
All right, well, let's see what we're hearing. So look at that. So 25% have employees declaring the needs, which is great to see. And then kind of a mix, pretty evenly split, actually. Awesome. It's neat to see. So kind of now shifting from how we're declaring those needs to how do you find people to do the trainings, right? This idea of collaborative learning is kind of into learning from our peers. So a study that we did in the US actually showed that 77% of our US learners said that they have knowledge that goes untapped. And so the reality is, if you don't have a platform for having them provide their knowledge to share it, you're not encouraging it, it's probably not going to happen. And as we see kind of the workforce shifting, where you have a lot of these, like that era of the baby boomers who are starting to move into retirement, and they have a lot of institutional knowledge from your organization, how do you tap that? How do you bring that into the organization and get them involved? And so I think the first step is kind of letting go of some of the misconceptions that we have about leveraging our SMEs, which is subject matter experts within the organization. So I think oftentimes we get caught up in this idea that they won't want to take on the role of the trainer. It's not their job. They're busy doing other things. And it's kind of that comment Amira made earlier around where some of your most engaged employees actually want to develop others. If you lean into that, you can really start to pull out these experts and help them help you. And so just to share some tips for working with your subject matter experts and how to make it really successful. And the first point that I want to hone in on is really ensuring that you're solving real problems. So you can have a lot of your team kind of raising their hand about different learning needs, but trying to understand what that need and what skill you're trying to address and how that's going to help solve a real problem will go a long way in kind of getting your experts to help you. And then the other thing that's important is to make it easy for them to share. So are you doing a video? Are you having them do an online training? Something that you can do that's scalable and doesn't require their time kind of over and over again can be really valuable and having a large impact, but without asking quite as much from them. And then I think the other piece, and this I think goes for any work that you're doing across departments, is letting them know, circling back with the impact that they had. So what were you measuring? What needle were you moving? And going back to them and letting them know how the impact came out. And that will want them to help you in the future. And it's also a great case study to have other experts come and help you, because you can kind of show how this learning from peers really helps drive kind of engagement. And so one thing I wanted to highlight when we talk about working with our experts within, it doesn't necessarily mean every single one of your employees has to be an expert who's contributing to this kind of collaborative learning space. But even if you just have 2% contributing, you can drive a lot of positive impact. We see that course relevance goes up by 95% when we're learning from our peers and the experts in the space. And that's a lot because they're the ones who know how to do it best. And so the content they're creating is going to be the most relevant. It's going to help people upskill faster, and it's going to drive more engagement. So now kind of tying the idea of peer learning and to drive performance and how that can really foster a collaborative culture. And we've done this study in the UK, and what we heard was that learning from your peers was considered the most effective way of learning. That was 61%, with coaching and mentoring kind of close behind. We also heard that 47% of British employees train themselves on the job, and 63% tend to learn as they go. And that really drives why leveraging collaborative learning can be so effective. So it makes it easy to engage the expert, it provides space to collaborate, and it can really start to influence how learning happens and how your team is upskilling. So thinking about how this concept of collaborative learning can really help to drive performance, before we dive into kind of the review part of it, I wanted to stop and ask how many of you are doing 360 reviews in your organization. And by 360 reviews, I mean gathering feedback from peers, not just from the coaches or your managers, not just from yourself, even the opportunity for individuals to provide reviews on their managers. So kind of that upward concept and really getting that full kind of 360 view.
While people are answering that, I'm just loving the point about how many employees, I think it was 77% you said, have knowledge but aren't asked to share it, because that is just it's just exactly how I've experienced it. That it's kind of like, you know, these people just like knowing that they have, you know, so much expertise. But the other point that you've made, Jessie, that I think is absolutely right, that it's like when you've got to make it easy, if you're going to give an employee the chance to share that expertise, they've got to be able to do it easily and not, you know, feel like they're going to have to write some massive course or do something that's like feels like L&D's job. But so it's
yeah, exactly. I think that's such a important part of it. Absolutely. All right, so let's see what the results are here, kind of on that 360 feedback. And it looks, again, pretty evenly distributed. That's interesting. So about 36% of you are doing that. And another 30 who want to do it in the future. So that's very interesting and great.
Although it's also looking at it, there's 60% who either aren't doing it or aren't doing it and do want to do it in the future. So there's a lot of scope for a lot more of this from the looks of it. Yeah,
I agree. A lot of opportunity. And hopefully some of the stuff we're talking about today will help kind of influence that. So kind of speaking about the 360 reviews and kind of why I ask that is that we kind of talk about getting feedback from your peers. And I think this ties a bit to kind of that continuous feedback Amira mentioned earlier. And you're starting to change that conversation when you're including feedback from those around you who are kind of in it in the day-to-day. It's not just observations coming from the top down, and it becomes a bit more of a conversation. And so similar to asking our experts and our peers around us to teach us and train us and kind of help us develop our skills, getting their feedback on how we're doing against those skills and how we're developing can be really valuable. And so that kind of brings it to kind of the combination of why it's so important, not just for our peers to provide feedback on how we're doing, but it allows us to see how we're moving against some of the skills we want to develop. Just to give you an example of how we think about it here at 360 Learning, if you're looking for some inspiration. So we do our reviews quarterly, and every other quarter, we nominate 3 peers to give us feedback. And those can be peers directly on our team, or they can be peers just that we worked with on a project, even if they sit on a different team. And it allows us to really gather direct and actionable feedback about the day-to-day work that we're doing and kind of how projects are going that we can then kind of scale into our own development. And that kind of takes me to this next point about taking the conversation beyond just what's going well or not going well and starting to think about the how behind it. So when you have learning needs or you have these gaps, how are you going to address them? And baking learning goals into your review cycles kind of starts to drive that full circle conversation and allows you to focus on the employee life cycle. It takes a broader lens of it. So you can imagine as employees come in and they're new in their role, right? They're identifying the skill gaps. They're working with their peers around them to build those gaps. And then you're talking about that ongoing in the review cycle. And as they start to master the role, the conversation shifts to what new skills do they need to learn to push them to the next level. And maybe that's thinking about career opportunities. What is their next step? But the more you can kind of have that conversation in a circular way where it's like, here's what I'm working on, here's how it's going, here's what I'm going to work on next. I think you really start to see that employee life cycle come to life, and you start to really upskill from within, and you're driving talent and increasing your talent density, which kind of goes full circle back to what Amira was talking about. Well, at a time like this, when you really want to have people engaged and really great talent within your organization. The more you can keep them engaged, grow their skills, the higher performing teams you're going to have and the more performance you're going to get out of your individuals, which drives engagement in turn. And so just to kind of leave you all with a few parting tips before we wrap up and move to Q&A. Make sure that you're, enhance performance management and training with peer feedback. Leverage peers to really help drive that. Leverage your subject matter experts, the ones around you, to help upskill your team from within. Make it easy for them, give them the opportunity to do it, and engage with them on how you can make that happen. And then bake learning into your performance management strategy. Kind of the more you can bring that conversation full circle, I think the more you move towards that kind of continuous performance management and really performance development, right? It's not just what's not going well, but how we're continuing to develop and grow. And I will stop there.
Great, I'll jump back in. Thanks so much, Jessie and Amira. Some really great discussion points and some pointers there that I'm sure everybody can take away and implement in their organizations. So that concludes our presentations for today. But just before we jump into the Q&A, if you'd just like to hear about some more topics discussed that we talked about today, or if you'd like to see Appraisd or 360 learning platforms in practice, we'd love to hear from you. So you can do so with the links on the screen now. And for anyone joining who is specifically in the learning and development space, I just wanted to mention that we run a great community for L&D professionals to network and share knowledge of topics similar to those that we discussed today. So I think Marie's going to add the link in the chat if you'd like to apply to that community there. But yeah, great. Let's jump into the Q&A. I'm just going to skip down here to our questions. Okay, first, so we have a question from Amir, and the question is, how often would you recommend them? I think this was in relation to the stay conversation. So Amir, if you want to take Amir's question to start with.
Okay, I think I guess it depends a little bit on the organisation, or as will always be the case. But I think in order for it to not be formulaic, which, as I said, is not necessarily ever a particularly good strategy, I would think that you'd probably want to do this on whenever you kind of feel as an organisation or as a manager maybe that it would be an appropriate time. So say there's been a reorganisation, for instance, you might want to have some stay conversations with either the whole team or particularly with the employees who you think might be a little bit unsettled, or particularly your talented ones. So I think it's probably needs must in some ways. But what I wouldn't recommend is that it's a kind of formula that it's like, it's now April, and so what we do is we do stay conversations throughout the organisation, because that's really not going to achieve what you're trying to achieve, which is keeping hold of your engaged employees by letting them know they're individuals who you care about. That would be my view. But as I said, I've never done them, actually, to be honest. So it would be a bit of an experiment, I think. I don't know, Jessie, if you have a view.
I agree with that. I think that putting some guidelines into place for your organization around what might trigger a reason to have a stay conversation, I would try and push for it to be a bit more proactive than reactive. But I think any org change, any kind of event that happens at the org is a great time for it. I would be thoughtful about who I wanted to have the stay conversations with. And you could see them kind of being almost ongoing throughout the year, but who it is you're talking to and what you're talking about and kind of why you're approaching that team or that individual may change, but kind of keeping it top of mind always and as needed.
Agree.
Absolutely. So we've got another question here from Mikkel. On the one hand, digital learning enhances new types of ways to interact and learn. But this, with a huge focus at times like these, are we at risk about forgetting the valuable old school peers? I'm not sure, Jessie, if you want to take this one first. Are we at risk of kind of forgetting the in-person old school peers learning from each other that way with digital learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone learns in such different ways, and kind of if you go back to, I think one of the studies that I kind of mentioned is where people are learning. I think it was, I'm forgetting the exact statistic, like 47% of people in the UK kind of are learning on their own and on the job and while they go. And so I think when we were all in person and in offices, there was an easier way to kind of ask the person next to you for questions and tap into that knowledge much more quickly and easily. And so I don't think you can discount the value of that. But as we start to shift strategy into being a bit more of a remote organization, people are working from the office, they're working from home, they're not always right there. It makes it really important to have other opportunities to lean into different ways of learning. And so I think one of the abilities to kind of create virtual trainings that people can tap into when they're looking to answer that skill or up level that skill or answer that question can go a long way in helping people kind of learn at the pace they're learning at and learn in the moment that they want to learn. So I don't think we should ever discount it or forget about that. But I think that as a strategy, L&D organizations need to start having other things in place that allow people to develop these skills in other ways when we're not all next to each other at our desks and in the office anymore.
Absolutely. And we've got another question here from Katerina. How can we assess peers' SMEs' ability to share their knowledge? Meaning they can be great at a particular topic, but not able to teach or share their knowledge with others in a productive way. Maybe Jessie, you want to take that question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's totally spot on. Everyone has kind of different, a lot of times what's the expression we have here? If you can't do, you teach, or if you can do, you don't typically teach. I think that's where the L&D team really comes in, and where you can leverage your expertise in how people learn, the best ways to help put information together and disseminate it. And so I think that when you are working with your SMEs to kind of help build this content and create that collaborative learning style, there's still a huge role for L&D and kind of HR and anyone who's really great at learning and deciphering information to help facilitate how that can come together. And so I encourage, if you think about moving to that direction, making sure you stay involved and you're not just necessarily letting everyone to their own devices. And you can even do that through creating your own courses and your own different virtual trainings and learnings of like, what's the best way to put information together and kind of help give people a head start in how to think about it when it may not be their background.
Absolutely. Have you got anything to add there, Amira?
No. I think it's, as you said, it's work with what people know and what they can, most easily kind of share, really. So, and as Jessie has said, I think the L&D community really does have a fantastic role to play to kind of help people and support people to do it and to, grab the knowledge from them. But I think the L&D community really does, it's not a kind of hand it all over moment. It's, they are coordinating the efforts. And no, beyond that, no. I do like the question though. How should a company decide what's best as an approach to performance management and L&D? Which I'd love to answer the performance management bit of that, if we can take that one.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'll take performance management and leave Jessie to do L&D. But how should a company best decide what's best to do with performance management? I think this is one that's really dear to my heart, because I don't think there's many other processes that have such enormous reach as performance management, where every single employee and manager uses it pretty well, I hope regularly, maybe not every day, but regularly, where it's so often a hand-me-down. It's a really strange thing where so often what we find is organizations have got a performance management approach they've either seen worked somewhere else because they've adopted it from a previous organization, or they've looked up on the internet best practice and they've kind of adopted something. And it often is almost like performance management by default rather than by design. And we really try to work with organizations to say, take a step back, think about your culture, your business sector, your type of employees. What would you most, if it was working perfectly for you, what would it look like? Is it about engagement? Is it about learning? Is it about alignment of objectives? Is it about well-being? There's a whole range of different stuff that performance management processes attempt to tackle. And yes, ideally you'd want it to do all of them, but it's almost like, well, in priority order, what would you most want? And then to kind of take a step back and say, and based on what we do, how much of that aligns? Because so often they want it to be about learning and about engagement, but actually that's right at the end of a long form. And the formers, before they ever got to that, had a whole load of stuff that people have to measure and critique and provide evidence about. And it's kind of almost like the whole learning and growth part is very much shoved to the end of the process. So long story to say, I think there's a lot of stepping back and working out from an organizational perspective what matters most, and then really making sure that that is what the process is ticking first and foremost, and not necessarily trying to do it all in one go.
And I'd echo that on the L&D side. I feel like it's a very similar, you want to ask yourself similar questions, right? What is your culture? What is your employees? What are they looking for? How does it work? What business are you in? What types of training do you need? And really taking that into account to set something up that works for your organization, and then prioritizing around it. And I think there's always so many different approaches depending on how big your team is. Do you have an L&D department? If not, how does learning then play into it? And so I don't think there's a one size fits all. It has to be really kind of individual to the company, and you can leverage best practices and kind of see what other people are doing and pull it into your approach. But there's always kind of that element of what is it that your company and your team needs.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. So I think we've gone through all of the questions for today. So I'm just going to wrap up. I really hope that you found these presentations and these discussions useful, and you'll look for ways to kind of apply these pointers in your organization. So just a reminder that once the session is finished, you'll receive the links to watch this back whenever you like. And of course, feel free to share it with any colleagues. So I'd just like to say thanks to our speakers, Jessie and Amira. Thanks everyone for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks, Freddie. Thanks, Amira. It was fun.
Thank you for having us. Bye.
Bye, all.